coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
And if you think that adults and fellow citizens can't read what you think is racist and hateful and not be changed by it, then we don't have citizenship. Like, citizenship doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, we got off on the wrong foot by thinking, like, how can we reform this web filter that grown adults are being, like, having imposed upon them in the workplace? Like, screw reforming the web filter. Like, screw your damn filter. I'm a grown ass man. Like, this is just, the whole thing is bunk.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast here at the American Mind of the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. I'm joined in studio, as we occasionally are these days, from Tennessee, on a plane, here now, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind, James Pullis, in the computer with Seth and Matt. James is executive editor of the American Mind. Matt, of course, vice president of education, founding editor of the American Mind. And Seth Barron is the managing editor of the American Mind. Well, today, apologies to those of you who've read my Substack piece from today, which brings up some of this already, but we thought we'd open with Liz Cheney, who was defenestrated this morning, as Jonah Goldberg put it in his I don't know if it's a G file or what. I just saw the headline. I don't try not to read them too much. Defenestrated by her fellow Republicans in the Republican caucus in the House. This is interesting because on February 3rd, these votes are always secret. On February 3rd, she survived handily by about 84 vote margin. So there's clearly a media and comms rollout plan behind her, because there was a long piece in the Washington Post this morning. You've seen one of these, you've seen them all. It's an investigative journalist piece by a couple of authors. They crop up in the New York Times or the Washington Post with a lot of quotes. These things rarely happen by accident. The comms department or the PR shops for various politicians usually have a hand in helping them come into be. And this had all the hallmarks of that. And it was, Liz Cheney's plan to go to war with President Trump, including ramped up travel of late. She's going to be doing more fundraising so that she can help other candidates against Trumpy candidates. So this is clearly, I think she knew this vote was coming, and partly made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. And she's using it as a media opportunity. I'll just, interestingly, and I brought it up in the American Mindset piece, I just came across this old Sam Francis essay on I think it was called "Revolution is in the Air," and he was talking. It's from 1997. He talked about Buchanan, about Gingrich. He talked about the kind of rise of conspiracy theories on the right, the loss of confidence in what the government tells us or what the mainstream establishment tells us on either right or left amongst a certain portion of the right, and then he sort of mused and turned over a bit, with a possibility of conservative revolutionaries in America, or the overturning of what he saw as a pretty corrupt order. Hilariously, most of it could have been written yesterday, including a Bill Kristol quote. So remarkably, this is what Sam Francis wrote in 1997. And tell me if this is all that dated or not. Of course, not everyone on what is usually called the right harbors sympathy for revolutionary change. Soon after Buchanan started talking about peasants storming the castles with their pitchforks, Bill Kristol was dragged forth by the Washington Post to enlighten us with his own cogitations. Someone needs to stand up and defend the establishment, he whined. In the last couple of weeks, there's been too much pseudo-populism, almost too much concern and attention for, quote, the people. That is, the people's will, their prejudices, and their foolish opinions. And in a certain sense, we're all paying the price for that now. After all, we conservatives are on the side of the lords and barons. Mr. Crystal is correct. Conservatives, those who want to conserve, are on the side of the lords and barons. And the fact that the delusions and pathologies of the left have long since acquired political and cultural hegemony in the United States means that real conservatives like Mr. Crystal wind up defending the achievements and interests of the left. When he, his colleagues among the neoconservatives, and the mainstream of the Republican Party denounce Buchanan for his attacks on the establishment, they betray the reality that all their right-wing affectations are masks for the defense of the incumbent system of power. So this was interesting. I mean, you drop out the Buchanan and put in Trump, and it's definitely very current. It just shows the amber we've been frozen in to a certain extent for the last 20 years on the right. I think Trump finally broke through that a bit. And the fact of folks like Liz Cheney, and then there's this other short New York Times piece. We get to learn more tomorrow when the whole announcement drops. But folks led by Evan McMullen and Miles Taylor. Miles Taylor was the anonymous that wrote the book, allegedly wrote the book, and the New York Times op-ed piece. I have reason to wonder whether it was actually just Miles. It might have been his boss as well. Wrote this piece, and Miles says that tomorrow they're going to announce 100 or so former GOP types who are going to issue an ultimatum of sorts to the party that, if they don't shape up in the following ways, they might be forced to start a third party. All of this, I think, is perfectly explained, maybe not perfectly, but pretty closely explained by Francis's categories back 20 years ago or over 20 years ago, which is to say, establishment conservatism or conservatism Inc., and this has been a theme of ours for a while, can't really help but conserve leftism these days after over a century of liberalism. So it's no surprise that Trump, the latest firebrand to marshal some sort of national political coalition, and I think his predecessors include Richard Nixon, Barry Goldwater to a certain extent, though Barry never assumed high office, Ronald Reagan, those are his predecessors. And I think Trump is continuing in that line, or continued in that line, this kind of populist revolt against the established elite. And, anyone on the right who's part of that established elite and who defends the establishment, quote unquote, like Crystal does, can't but help defend leftism, or at least, all they can offer is a bit of a break on leftism. So that is no way to restore a constitutional structure. It sort of precludes from the beginning the counter-revolutionary things that we think ought to take place to save and preserve America. So I would view Liz Cheney and all of that, no matter what she says about her quote-unquote, the quote-unquote big lie or January 6th. I think all of her recalcitrance and the people like hers recalcitrance in the light of Trump would have existed and continued no matter what he'd said about the 2020 election and no matter what happened on January 6th.
Well, the sanctity, the self-congratulation with which it seems people from Crystal up to Cheney defend this, what I believe our own Matt Peterson has called the politics of principled loserdom. This is what is really quite galling to me. I mean, upon her departure, Cheney said, "We must go forward based on truth. We cannot both embrace the big lie and embrace the Constitution." This obviously false dichotomy and just the snide. I mean, the degree to which Crystal, if you listen to the way Crystal talks about the people who are supporting Buchanan, you listen to the way somebody like Rick Wilson talks about the people who vote for Trump, right? These credulous boomer rubes who masturbate to anime. I mean, this is a extremely disdainful, arrogant rulership class whose rulership is secured for them in the uniparty system by losing again and again in the against the interests of the people that they're supposed to defend. I mean, it's kind of heartening to me that the movement is going in this direction. It suggests to me that we may not have to actually found a new Republican Party if these folks are the ones that are, draining out of the party, and if these 100 people really do feel like they need to depart after, go down with the sinking ship or whatever ludicrous rhetoric they'll invent to justify it, right? I mean, this fine, this seems good. And we published in the American Mind, there's an article, The GOP That Works, about that Jim Banks memo, how to reclaim the Republican Party, how to win the House back as a working class party. I mean, if that's the way the realignment is going to go, I think it's wholly salutary. Let's, no reason to make a new party if we can just actually reclaim the Republican Party for the interests of, the American people.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it just, when I saw this, that 100 people, 100 Republicans are threatening to leave and form a third party. Well, do they think that, I mean, it reminds me of like a kid threatening to leave a sleepover if, people don't stop, playing a game that he doesn't like. Nobody, do they understand that you can't form a new party just with 100 people? I don't think they have any constituency. That's what they seem to be so mad about, that nobody really cares. It's the whole, like, I'll take my ball and go home, but they don't even have a ball or a court. It all reminds me, I remember when I first heard of David French, and maybe I was late to the party on that, but was in May of 2016 when Bill Kristol said, I have a candidate. I have someone who can run for president and win. And it's David French. And it was like, what? It was so preposterous. The idea that this was going to be the face of like a new party. They have nothing. They represent maybe like, I don't know, 5,000. I mean, how many people could they bring with them? So yeah, I think you're totally right. If they leave, that'd be great. Then we don't have to bother kicking them out.
Yeah, Bill Kristol in that Washington Post piece was quoted as saying, I don't know how many people this is, but it could be 15 to 17% of the 15 to 17% of the GOP electorate. And that would mean it would, do real damage. And he'd be right if that were true. But I color me skeptical with you, Seth.
Well, the goal appears to be to do real damage and not much more than that. I mean, Vladimir Putin is regularly the target of criticism from U.S. and Anglosphere elites who say, this is a guy who his idea of managed democracy means, contributing to the campaigns of members of the opposition, and they're just this sort of, fabricated fake opposition that, really isn't going to challenge the people in power, and like what a corrupt and debased form of government Vladimir Putin oversees. And then you shift your gaze over to the United States and you look at what the ultimate allegiances are of the people who are trying to fracture the Republican Party now. And they too, in some ways, resemble a controlled opposition. They too, resemble a faction that purports to be some kind of true opposition, but in fact is really just dedicated to maintaining the attention and maintaining the coverage and maintaining the donor funds necessary to performing politics at a national level, regardless of whether they have a base or connect with the base or represent their constituents that they were elected to represent. It is virtual politics, and those who live in glass houses should not be throwing stones.
I should flag for our friend Byron York, who the one other thing I brought up in the article was, Byron said it's not, Cheney was not removed because they were mad at her for impeaching Trump, or even for some of her comments on January 6th. It's that, because they were fine with her on February 3rd, most of the caucus. It's that she had clearly made the decision that was revealed in that Washington Post piece, which is that she was going to continue to hammer at this indefinitely. And her party, purportedly with her as the leader of the caucus in certain ways, needs to rely on her to do the effective political things, the effective vote whipping, the effective on the hustings work to help them regain the House in 2022. And that just, was going to be impossible and untenable if she was committed as she seemed to be, and as it was confirmed with her media rollout right upon being removed, to just, not letting this go.
Well, the performativity of the whole thing is really pretty remarkable. I mean, this principle theater where people build their brand around like being the principled politician who's not going to play politics, who's not going to bend to the whims of the moment, is going to stick by his guns, you know, no matter come what may. I mean, honestly, like Andrew Yang is kind of like a analog for this on the blue side, where it's, you know, he said some things I like, some things I don't like, but his whole brand is like he's a renegade, he's a rebel, and it's like the like actual outcome of that is failure. And it's not that you shouldn't have principles. Everybody should have principles. It's just that when somebody starts talking about how principled they are as like their self-definition, like if you have to talk about it that much, you're probably not, right? You're probably like, in fact, involved in the most base kind of politicking, which is just like mere self-presentation and virtue signaling. And we do sort of fall for this. There's a certain kind of conservative, I think, that goes for this principle porn. And like, I'm very, very glad to see people having less and less patience for it. And unfortunately, I think the reason that they do is because the consequences, you know, politics isn't a game anymore. Like politics is when you're in a time of relative prosperity and comfort and peace, you can sort of listen comfortably to people standing up and mouthing and grandstanding and then go back to your life. Now, when they are reaching into every crevice of your being and demanding authority over every aspect of your existence and doing so in the most destructive, most invasive, most degrading possible ways, when the Democrats are taking control of the country in this just completely destructive way, then, you know, you no longer, I think, have the patience to be like, well, our guys are the principal guys, you know, like, and once again, like, far be it from me to say that you should not have beliefs according to which you operate and goals that you pursue. But like, as we are fond of stressing here at Claremont, the great political virtue of prudence dictates that sometimes you get in the fight, you get scrappy, and you take your knocks, and you don't always look like the most, you know, virtuous person. You don't always come out smelling like roses. I think if there's anything that the voter base, I hope, is becoming impatient with, it's this notion, this sort of plain self-dealing in which a politician exists basically to make you think that he's the good guy. Like, we are very, very done with that, and we should be.
Maybe I'll just be cut from the podcast, but all I really have to say is cucks. I mean, the cuckery is, I mean, there's so many things that one could say, but at the end of the day, it's clear that there's a certain part of the party that is leaning on this notion of principles. It's doesn't actually have anything to do with the real issues at play or the real tensions at play. It's not about principle, in fact, at all. It is about the prudent maneuver in the situation. And prudence does not mean you reject principles. It means that you can't have a kind of rigid, anytime someone says there's a rigid framework of action that's very easy, I have my moral decoder, decoder ring, or I have my little decoder that I put over the text and it shows me the words that have been secretly laid out there in some perfect way, just doesn't understand anything about traditional ethics. But I mean, at the end of the day, she's just pure cuckery. I mean, she wants to go talk on CNN. She will go talk on CNN. And there is a segment of the party that's perfectly fine with that. And I mean, I guess one, I think, kind of hopeful aspect of this, it's already kind of come out in the conversation, is this was a psyop that got waylaid. The base wasn't having it. Even the other leaders in the party weren't having it. In a way, the actual story here, I feel as if it's a good one. It's the Washington Post has been writing about her for many, many months about being the conscience of the Republican Party. I mean, they had a huge article about her months ago. I mean, many months ago. They've been setting her up for this situation for a long time, along with their little friends in the establishment, Republican circles. As Ryan points out, there's no accident here. So they've been setting her up for a long time. And what happened is, it actually, if you look kind of history book level and zoom out, it all failed miserably. No one cares about her. No one cares about her little campaign. This is just like the Lincoln Project, right? I mean, it's just radicalizing people who think they're moderates. That's what she does. So that's effective for the left. But, I mean, it failed. It failed. And that's a good thing.
I mean, the other thing about this idea of leaving the Republican Party. Didn't this gang already leave the Republican Party? I thought that they all endorsed Biden.
It's like Damon Linker leaving the Catholic Church. I think he's done it 3 or 4 times, right? That's what they all do.
Why stop now?
Didn't Fromm or someone else, like, was it Tom Nichols? Haven't they all like left the Republican Party multiple times?
I think they all want to divide, somehow draw a line. Not all of them, but some of them draw a line that say, whether it's Crystal, I voted for Biden this time, but I didn't vote for Hillary. I think Tom Nichols said something similar, that he didn't actually vote for Hillary, but he couldn't vote for Trump. I mean, it's all, and even, Jonah Goldberg, who said, like, if my vote actually determined whether Clinton or Trump would win, I would have voted for Trump, but it didn't, so I didn't. No, the Miles Taylor line, the Washington Post has some, or the New York Times, they all do, Axios, the rest. They all repeat this line that he was a senior administration official in the Trump administration. Trump roasted that today in one of his now, tweets by from the desk of, Trump has started a blog. It's pretty funny. He said, no, I'd never met the guy. I don't really know. Maybe, laid eyes on him once, but he was not a senior administration official. He was an underling to Kirstjen Nielsen. Yeah, Miles, his finishing quote for this short New York Times piece was, "I'm hanging on to the Republican Party by the skin of my teeth, but I might have to go some other direction." So there's a certain faction of them that want to maintain that somehow they're still Republicans, but we should know better.
Well, they just want to be the loyal opposition, like permanently.
Yeah, that's right. Anton's Washington Generals analogy holds up well from Flight 93 election. That whole essay holds up pretty well, frankly. Okay, well, enough about Liz Cheney and the GOP infighting. Our friend, I'll just mention one last thing, and I think Kurt is right on this. Our friend Kurt Mills, who's proved pretty perspicacious and pretty has had pretty sound judgment over how politics would go over the last few years. When he was a Publius Fellow, we were in when was that, Matt? Was it the summer of 19, I think?
18 or 19.
Yeah.
Maybe it was 19. Yeah.
Yeah. And Kurt said, I mean, that's when the primary was going, right? Maybe it was 18. Anyway, he said, Kurt said, oh, come on, Biden. Biden's going to be the nominee. He's going to limp along. He's going to pull through strong in South Carolina, and he's going to roll it up. And it was just one of the instances in which Kurt, who follows all this very closely, was right. But Kurt's tweet today was, I think, correct, which is, in 30 days, no one will really even remember / care about Liz Cheney. It'll be just like the Lincoln Project, like you said, Matt. I think that's right. So Kurt
was 19, by the way. 19 Publius Fellow.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that makes sense in the thick of the primary, or the beginning of the primary season anyway. Good. Let's talk about, speaking of former fellows, our good friend, Johnny Burtka, who runs ISI, formerly of the American Conservative, reported today on Twitter that he went to go sign up for our conference on woke capital, which is next Tuesday in DC. It's not an open invitation. Sorry, folks. COVID lingers in DC, and we just had to cap it. And so, we can't just let anyone in these things.
There's not make excuses for that.
Just have a limit to what we can afford. Yeah. But, it'll be interesting. It's we've got Andy Puzder speaking, Mike Anton, Dan McCarthy, Joel Kotkin, who has a new paper that's getting finished up for us on woke capital, or in some ways on woke capital, but it's on the oligarchy too, or the left, and then a lunch address by J.D. Vance. So that should be fun. Johnny reported that he went to go sign up, and his web security system, which, these things are filters for who in your C3 or organization, more broadly speaking, who can go where on what websites. And a lot of it's automated and has certain settings and all the rest. But Johnny Burtka went to just go to dc.claremont.org, which I mentioned at the end notes in this all the time for the website for our DC center, and then /events/woke capital. And he got an error screen that said, your internal web security system will not let you go here because this consists of hatred or racist content. So this, in a way, is a cousin of the run-in we had with Google a couple years ago. So it's not surprising in a sense. I mean, our DC website is dedicated to, among other things, calling out identity politics. And the piece on the American Mind that triggered Google's banning of us doing retargeting ads a couple years ago was I think it was either me or the chairman Tom Klingenstein arguing against multiculturalism. So this is just another example of constrained discourse. And it increasingly seems to be the case that to call out identity politics, except from a very narrow range of acceptable criticism or friendly criticism, is itself kind of hate speech and racist, systemically or otherwise. This is just the latest small example, which, like Google will use it to our advantage. But it's not a good develop in the wider realm of public discourse or deliberative democracy.
Well, there's so many reasons to overreach, that don't even really have anything to do with principle, but just have to do with classic self-interest. If you do believe in the precautionary principle, you don't that just militates in favor of over enforcement, so that you don't end up leaving anyone out who should have been nailed. If you're worried about political pressure, you're going to over enforce. If you are a lazy bureaucrat, you are going to be classically inclined to ensure that your corner of rules and regulations are over applied. Why would you want to under apply them? And that, that's the danger here is not just woke crusaders, but it's the people who just kind of go along with it because they're mainly concerned about keeping their paycheck coming and keeping their turf protected, and being eaten last, or maybe even not at all if they manage to burrow their way deep enough into the bureaucracy that people forget they're there. These are all reasons why over enforcement would be a problem, and it clearly is. And that's an entire separate slice of the case against what's happening online that goes beyond fanaticism.
We should probably say at this point, maybe we'll have more by the time this is out. But right now we don't know the full details of whatever happened. But of course, the hilarious thing is, in a way, right, none of us would be surprised by anything.
Yeah.
So any level of the different companies involved, the settings, we all know how this works. And in this case, I hope that if we discover really which it probably is, right, some kind of attack, it should be considered an attack, then, we should encourage people not to use this company and say this company is incompetent. And the irony, of course, is the actual event is about woke capital and what to do about it. I hope people tune in, right? There's a live stream. They can hear it.
Yeah, that's right.
You should really listen in because there will be some people there who both have skin in the game and are able to talk about this issue with some, with something to say. So this is, I think, these kinds of events where people are talking about what is to be done that Claremont is sponsoring. There's only going to be more of them, and they're going to be attacked in more vicious ways. And because I'm just kind of feeling in this white pill mood tonight for every discussion, this is just what James has been saying for a while. This kind of attack, which is what this is really indicative of how desperate or how intense the feeling is that there's some kind of losing of control, and these people have to keep control. And I think it's hilarious because they own every institution in the country, and these are the most powerful institutions in the world. But at the same time, it reminds me a little bit of Vegas. Like Vegas, what's really weird is the insecurity of the house. They win, so that's not a good sign for America. But, you get these groups of people who come in, and of course, maybe there's ones you've never heard of, and that's why they're successful. But you get these groups who come in, and they figure out really inventive ways to skim money from the casinos. But it doesn't take a lot of money. You look at these stories in the past, and it's a few $1 million, and the house figures it out. And that's a pittance, right? And I kind of feel like that's what's going on in America, right? You get a little bit of energy of people saying, actually, no, we're going to actually talk about the problem and do something. And then they pounce. So The question is, is there enough resistance building that will help foster the degeneration or decay of the system? Or is this just a case of another, small example of the fact that the house always wins?
I have a question that may just be like, I may be being too extreme here, but I'm looking at this screenshot of our event being blocked. This is website not allowed. The category hate and racism is restricted. And stipulating everything that James said about over precaution, agreeing that there is baked into this a kind of just mechanism for clamping down more and more, agreeing with you, Matt, also that the system is sort of perceives itself to be weak and therefore is behaving in aggressive ways to compensate for its weakness. Why should hate and racism be blocked? like even imagine that this is a website that's hateful and racist. Like, I can totally see why if you ran a company, you would not want people to like be able to access porn or whatever on the computer. Like, that's incredibly disruptive to a work environment and so forth, and also like gross. But like, shouldn't you be allowed to look up hateful, racist things? Like, seriously, like I feel like we're already so many levels into accepting the premise of this whole concept that you would have you would even build a system within some random company that would prevent people from accessing websites that you or whatever algorithm has been written by whatever, woke intern at whatever Silicon Valley company like has determined is hateful and racist. But like, even if it is hateful and racist, aren't we allowed to read and think about hateful, racist things? Like, it's weird to me that this is only now occurring to me because like, we're so wrapped up in like, well, it's crazy that Claremont got blocked. Obviously, we're not hateful and racist. Like, what if we were? Like, you should be allowed to read things on your computer like that have unacceptable ideas in them.
Yeah, it's like that.
Well, so like, I mean, the criminalization of hate is something that, as far as I can tell, has never been attempted in the history of the world. And the more you think about it, the more reasons why that might be a bad idea begin to surface in the mind, in the active, sentient mind, a mind free of worms. It isn't a good idea, and I'm not going to belabor the podcast with explanations of why, but it's also just paradox. I mean, the very same people who seem to act as if the only way that America can be shifted into productive action is by terrifying everyone that the Nazis are coming back. These very same people then act as if the only way that we can prevent the Nazis from coming back is to ensure that everyone forgets that they had ever existed. Both of those things can't be true, and I suspect both of them are false.
Well, you can also make the argument that it's valuable for people to know what Nazis and racists say, because otherwise, how will you know who the racists are? I mean, if it's really important that we identify racists in our society in order to exclude them, even, I mean, presumably you'd want to know who they are. But all of this kind of avoids the fact, and this goes back to what James was saying, that this is all just for the purpose of bureaucratic CYA. Companies face major liabilities from lawsuits and Department of Justice investigations regarding, hateful climates or unpleasant, a bad work environment.
Yeah.
So, blocking websites is a good way to demonstrate that they have been over conscientious in keeping their environment sanitary. So that's really what this is about. And hate and racism is just a term of art for whatever they don't like, as we all know. So. Yeah. But I agree. I mean, why not let 1,000 hateful flowers bloom?
Ugly, hateful, racist flowers. It does. I mean, just the more I stare kind of into this, is probably bad for my mental health that I'm doing this, but the more that I stare into this screenshot and just imagine myself in a world where I work for a company that like places this filter on my browser that I use for my work computer, the more demoralizing and infantilizing it feels. I mean, what am I like? I remember having a filter like this on my web browser in middle school because I was a child and because I had adults who like were shaping me, who were devoted to shaping me morally and didn't want me to be accessing things that might like, you know, harm me, my precious soul as it grew up through its impressionable years. Like,
Precisely.
And they failed miserably. It's clear, but this is just there's just something incredibly sickening about it that sort of makes you understand why people are reacting to like the BAP stuff. You know, why people are reacting to just like this sort of neo-Nietzschean like disgust with all of these like sickly people who won't let you take a breath without like, you know, critiquing your own, you know, I mean, it's like the nanny state is like far too kind a term for this. James's pink police state is certainly much better, but it's like the pink police state deploys its brainworms essentially to just like colonize every inch of your gray matter. It's gross.
Yeah, it's the trend of treating half of the citizenry like children. And it's accelerating. And the standards by which people are judged to be children or adults, you know, change with the latest fad on the left, which often migrates from the campus, hence where we find ourselves in the current, you know, anti-racist theory moment where stuff that was confined to, you know, kind of neo-Marxists at law schools in the 80s is now out roaming free in the HR departments in federal and state governments and in corporations. I was just up in, some of you know, I was just up visiting Angelo Codavilla for a couple of days in Plymouth, California. He has a beautiful vineyard up there. And Angelo's point, which was a good one, was, and he's kind of said it in print in various ways over the years, but he said, you know, he called out this our democracy business, a threat against our democracy. He loves this kind of thing. He says, well, what do they mean by our democracy? He says they mean their oligarchy, because what is democracy? Do they mean voting? Well, no, the voters of Georgia, Arkansas, who try to do something deliberately with their political majorities across their states about things of great public import are not allowed to do those things, or if they are, it will soon be overturned by some federal court or some consent decree. So, you know, he was just stressing a theme that's been on the minds and on the pen tips of many of our friends lately, which is this regime that we're looking at in America should be called that, and it's something other than an outgrowth of our normal constitutional processes. And no, I'm not talking about the 2020 election, whatever you think about that. It's what Angelo was writing about, you know, 20 years ago in his ruling class, country class piece for The Spectator that turned into a small book. And that's, you know, it's what Sam Francis was getting at in that 97 piece as well. So the defenders of this regime, whether they be of the quote unquote conservative or centrist or Democrat or leftist variety, are kind of all in the same camp. And that's how we ought to look at it. And that gives a new sort of, and it's not new. It's not new in America, but it's what's given our politics this populist insurrectionary, if I can use that term, overused these days, flavor from a good portion of the populace. And we shouldn't be surprised that that portion of the populace that never quite seems to be able to do anything meaningful with their political power when they marshal it, views the other part of it, the establishment part of it, as illegitimate, dishonest, and therefore something to be got around, to be ignored, you know, alternative sources of truth to be sought out. I mean, that's what's driving our current national political malaise, that divide.
Yeah, the more I look at very good.
Sum up a little bit, for, I don't know, maybe it's for more normie listeners. I mean, so basically what we're saying is, right, there's two options. If you look at this tagline, hateful speech, racist speech is banned. And, you know, one is, there's two throughways here that should be dealt with. One is, the assumption is that hateful or racist speech has such causality, right? It says such power that it needs to be banned in the same way that societies have always thought obscenity should be banned. And obscenity should be banned is because it's super attractive. Like people, you know, especially men, but also women, you know, they're interested in sexuality being depicted or just grotesque things being depicted in ways that are just very attractive. You want to look at it. As the story goes, Leontius wants to see the dead bodies after the battle, and he can't stop himself from looking at them in ancient Greek philosophy. So the obscenity was always something that you did actually want to curb, even in quote unquote free speech societies. It was taken for granted that obscenity was out of bounds just because it's a bad influence. It's a, yeah, sure, there's a line, but generally, like, you know it when you see it. And for the most part, you know when you see it is actually pretty good, like for porn's sake. And then the liberals get all up in arms about the gray area, but there's always going to be an arbitrary area. Who cares? You cut it off, and we get it. But the hate and hate speech is a little different. And here you're saying that if you hear certain ideologies, they're so attractive, like a kind of pornography, that people can't help themselves and will become Nazis if they read it. I mean, that's essentially like the assumption here, right? And that really bears looking at closely. I mean, because that's really how they think of you. That's how they think of everyone. That's how they think of normal people. You can't help yourself but become a Nazi. You will become a Nazi by default if you read this kind of propaganda because of the evil or deficiency of your soul. And I think that's really sad, because I grew up in America in which that certainly wasn't the case, right? I mean, at least that's not how I think the default modes of control over speech worked. You, in fact, thought, this kind of thought was low status and it'll work itself out in the wash. And I don't actually think in this case that was an insane idea. On the other hand, things have changed, and they've pushed a certain doctrine for a long time. So they're very scared of anyone who opposes it, whether or not we say those people are Nazis. So the other way to look at it is this, which is the more cynical way, and I think prosaic, probably everyone listening to the podcast agrees, which is that, yeah, pretty much everything they don't like, as we've said, they call hateful and racist. But the important point is, very well said, by all of you, and I'm glad to be here. I mean, we need to promote this message that Spencer is laying out. The entire premise of hateful and racist speech being banned is insane. And if you think that adults and fellow citizens can't read what you think is racist and hateful and not be changed by it, then we don't have citizenship. Like, citizenship doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, we got off on the wrong foot by thinking, like, how can we reform this web filter that grown adults are having imposed upon them in the workplace? Like, screw reforming the web filter. Like, screw your damn filter. I'm a grown ass man. Like, this is just, the whole thing is bunk.
Yeah. And we should clarify, I know none of you are implying it, but people might draw the wrong conclusion. Our good friend Johnny Burtka is not, nor has his board of directors before him or his former leadership imposed such a ban on his, or a filter on his internet servers that he accesses through ISI, but it's rather some of these third parties that provide this kind of normal CYA type stuff. Yeah. Well, one man's racism is another man's philosophy. I mean, we're not quite saying that because we would never be so relativistic, but I mean, the real crux of the problem is a long running theme on the American mind, which is, if you disagree and picking up on what Matt's talking about, if you disagree as fellow citizens about anthropology, human nature, and the nature of truth, then these things just become matters of power. And they're just yet another front or dividing line between fellow citizens that is kind of becomes unbridgeable in a way.
Well, and I would just tack on here that, the regime level solution to this unsolvable problem, it was, as we all know, to permit and encourage and to some degree institutionalize a certain salutary pluralism in America, regional, cultural, demographic. In order to have that kind of arrangement, you need a certain sort of constitution, whether written or unwritten. I think written helps in this case. At least it certainly helped us for most of our existence as a country. And as technological pressure leads people in many different countries around the world to realize that hearts and flowers and good intentions and following your dreams are not going to be enough to restore human governance to digital machines. Many of those countries will continue down the road of establishing more or less a religion and using technology as a way of both enshrining that religion in public life, and as a way of ensuring that their control over their machines is one that can last. In the U.S., that's not going to work. That's not really compatible with our form of government. And so, I know that it can be frustrating to some Americans, on different ends of the political spectrum, depending on who you are, to look at China or Russia or India or Israel. And even the EU is doing this now to a certain extent and say, it's so much easier when you just give up on the messiness of pluralism. And, to an extent that's true, but what do you sacrifice? And what you sacrifice is the liberties and the customs and the habits and the mores that have made our American way of life what it is. So it's going to take extra work. It's going to take extra work on our part to make sure that as we pass into a digital age, we still have an American regime that's capable of supporting the kind of salutary pluralism that has prevented us, from suffering what so many other countries have suffered, which is a string of revolutions with regimes coming and going like the night and the day, and a fundamentally unstable country with factions of ostensibly fellow citizens who really just want to kill one another.
That's a good way to wrap up this segment. James, thank you. But I don't disagree with any of it. Well, we were going to talk about these absurd sort of neo-African statues unveiled today at Rockefeller Center. Another one that Seth saw near Penn Station and then used that. But I don't know. I'd rather talk about quickly. We have about 10 minutes left. The woke military as a nice follow-up to our discussion of the woke CIA. So we're just going to play the opening of this new recruiting video for the is it the Army, the Air Force? Doesn't matter. Roll tape.
This is the story of a soldier who operates your nation's Patriot missile defense systems. It begins in California, with a little girl raised by two moms.
Wow, we hit our 30, but you get the idea. The rest of the ad it's sort of her biography. She went to equality marches where she advocated for LGBTQ rights. She liked watching strong women and her two mothers. It's interesting because then later they get married and she supported them. And so, I mean, biologically, it never makes sense for a girl to have two mothers or any other variation in that sense. But it's just an odd. It's an odd and very postmodern ad, among other things. And it, at the end of it, it's all in cartoonish tones and cartoonish graphics. And then at the end, the young lady, it's kind of semi-flat anime type stuff. Go check it out. You all have seen the style before, but then at the end, she kind of turns to the camera and she turns into a real, I think it's probably Air Force, but I'm not sure. I beg forgiveness from our more militarily literate folks for I should know who mans Patriot missiles. Anyway, she turns the camera and she's a real live, looks to be, mid-20s at the most, young lady in the military. And it's a nice follow-up to the woke CIA video. I don't know what kind of thing they want to do as far as recruitment goes with this sort of thing. They've been having trouble recruiting. I just can't imagine that this is that attractive to the types of soldiers, airmen, seamen, et cetera, you want to attract to a military. But in that sense, it's perfectly in line with the current trajectory of the heights of our institutions, both political and corporate. So it's not surprising in that sense. I mean, we all, as Matt kind of intimated about the tech ban, our original Google ban, we were kind of righteously indignant a few years ago, but when we saw this one today, we just kind of chuckled. I think the same is true of this sort of thing. And it's aggressively progressing, if I can use those two together. You know, you see the CIA one and you go, my goodness, where are we? And then you see the one from DOD, and it's a far cry from the recruitment videos of the 80s, to say the least. And it's just, we should say also that there's the Tyler Cohen piece today that James brought to our attention, basically praising the
with a heavy heart. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, Cohen was praising it. James was not. He was bringing it to our attention of Tyler Cowen sort of praising the woke CIA video, saying, "Look, they have a real manpower shortage, and they are in Virginia, and you know that's a pretty they want to recruit from minorities who maybe have multiple language skills. Plus, if the CIA says that wokeism is cool, then it's really going to become passé soon. It's just it's one of these things that makes you reach the conclusion that everyone knows that most economists really should stay out of political commentary, especially when we're in high stakes regime politics, because it seems to completely misunderstand the trajectory of these things and what the end game is for the ideologies and the real activists pushing these into all of our institutions. And that is, it's a certain species of totalitarianism that's anti-nature, among other ills.
Yeah, I mean, I by now, everyone who listens to this podcast, and certainly everyone on this podcast, knows all too well what I think about wokeness and why. But it's been a very sunny day today. I had a big acai bowl for lunch, late lunch, and so I really, I want to give my approach here to the issue of the wokeification of the national security state the most benevolently generous interpretation that I can. And so, I'm willing to, for the sake of argument, to stipulate that, Tyler might be right about some of these things. And in fact, you don't have to go back very far, probably to the beginning of the downfall of Western civilization in a cesspit of decadence in the wake of World War I in cities like Berlin, to find that any intelligence network worth its salt and any spy master worthy of his job and in that sense his life would have no problem hiring people with massive character flaws and serious psychological problems and a checkered background. I mean, in some ways, right? Like a good intelligence service selects for those people. And it's true that in an earlier, rougher time, having a nickname like Bastard of Lesbians would have made you like pretty tough. But the people in these ads are not tough at all. And their checkered past is being laundered and turned into moral kitsch. And their psychological problems are being presented as psychological positives. And it's all very odd, but why is this happening? And one reason why it's happening is because there's a capitulation to, the woke religion. But to be generous, right? Like what would be like a more reasonable reason why this is happening? And I think it's because our intelligence and our security establishment simply believes that the kinds of wars that America is going to fight and is going to be willing to fight, and the only kinds of wars that America is going to be able to win are, in effect, information wars, propaganda wars, wars of the symbolic representation and manipulation of identity. And if you're going to be fighting those kinds of wars only, and if you think, crap, the American people aren't really going to want to fight any real wars anymore, and we've kind of destroyed America's like strategic state capacity, and we created the environment, the internet, but now it seems to be rewarding all these authoritarian states. What do we do at a time of declining American power and declining American leverage and a bottoming out of the moral fiber of the people? Well, you're going to need to be able to fight information wars, propaganda wars, wars of identity with foot soldiers, with troops who are fanatically devoted to that cause and think in precisely those terms. And so if I was really trying to be generous to our state security apparatus, I would interpret these events in this way. If I were to be a little bit less generous, I'd then turn things around and say, who asked to be painted into this strategic corner? Not me, probably nobody listening to this podcast. And probably even, ultimately, probably not even Liz Cheney has asked to be painted into this strategic corner. So, there are reasons, and bureaucrats can always convince themselves and each other that there's some good reason for continuing to do what bureaucracies do. But I think there's going to be a reckoning, and the ramp on the aircraft carrier here is much shorter than they think it is.
Let's just stipulate for the record what's going on in that ad, which isn't in the first 30 seconds, is this girl is saying, I was in these marches, for love, equality. I suppose it's gay marriage of some kind. And tied deeply into her identity, right, is this, is her parents. And even the way they're drawn, I'll get in trouble if I go into it, but if you look at it, so the whole point of it is we should say, regardless of what you're saying about the national security apparatus, the point of it for the public is this is what America means, right? Who this girl is represents America. And far be it for me to say, someone, the actual person they show at the end isn't an American or a citizen. Of course she is. But I think what's especially troubling, right, is that it's not just about assembling spy masters. It's about trying to define what the army, and that's what this ad is for. It's for the army. It's what the army is fighting for. And that's where you just look at it and think, okay, well, of course, the regime wants to double down on these things, but they're going to press it in front of everyone's face, and it's saying this is who we are, right? And this is what we represent, and this is what we're fighting for. And be that what it is. It is what it is. But that I think is, I think in some ways it's laughable. In other ways, it's just it's just usual propaganda from the government. But I think there's going to be a stream of content that is all of a piece, that is basically saying to America, this is why you sign up for the military now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, going from what James and Matt just said regarding like our future wars and who are they hiring and to prepare for these wars, and who are these wars going to be against? If in fact our future wars are going to be wars of identity and propaganda, it really seems like they're preparing to fight a war against the American people. Like that's who the next war is going to be against. That's what they're setting up to fight. Okay, there's at least 140, 160 million Americans who are not ready to go along with this program. And we have to staff up with people who are like essentially like a cadre, like a Red Guard of true believers who are like, who would be willing to actually go around and put people into re-education camps? Like that's who they need to get. And it seems like that's what they're kind of selecting for. People who are like, yeah, if you don't think that like a lesbian can have a penis, then you've got something seriously wrong with you and you need to be dealt with.
Well, I'm told that time is up, but we can't go out on that.
Well, I just want to say I absolutely agree with what Seth is saying. And just real briefly, that is absolutely what it seems like they're doing. And the first information war or PSYOP war that they're playing right now is absolutely against Red State America, essentially, in my opinion. I think he's right.
And it's worth noting in that context, right, that if you studiously devote yourself to a rhetoric that is tailor-made to alienate the kinds of people who typically enter into the American military, namely sort of red-blooded, patriotic young men, and if in fact you succeed at recruiting the sort of woke police and not at recruiting or at turning away the parents of those young men and those young men themselves, like you will not eradicate from the world the existence of an element in society of young red-blooded men with a lot of like excess martial energy to expend, right? That's a natural and just like eternal, always existing element of society. There's always a certain amount of sort of like, you know, energetic young men with a lot of aggression. And so like pointing that out is not inciting an insurrection, right? Or, you know, dangerously flirting with a coup. It's merely observing basic facts about political philosophy and human nature, right? So like, don't let anybody cow you from just pointing out that we are flirting with extremely dangerous, chthonic, primal forces that don't end well. Like, this is something that really, like, you know, of all the disingenuity that is currently part of our public discourse, like accusing people of a failure of patriotism or insurrectionary sort of premises, because you say like, gee, if you just sort of toss a bunch of red-blooded American males out of the mainstream of society, out of the military, and then also proceed to like delegitimate every organ of government, like what's going to happen? I don't know. That's just like shouldn't be controversial.
We'll have many more incitements to this conversation. I think Matt's correct. This will be of a piece with much of what we're going to observe, and it will get worse before it gets better. But it's just a riff off of Matt's the offering up of some white pills tonight. I think I really doubt how sustainable this is. I mean, you get the sense that look, it could muddle along pretty abusively for a while. We have to admit that, but you get the sense of some ricketiness around the edges here. One interesting point. I'll just finish with this. It's my trifecta of Sam Francis references. But in that same piece I mentioned, he said, he mused in 97, you know, some precipitous event would reveal the hollowness of the regime and its illegitimacy, and would initiate room for much more activity. He admits, of course, that these are, you know, dangerous ways of thinking about politics. The activity could go good or ill, but he thought a real shakeup needed to happen, and I think we're in agreement about that. When things are dire, you have to take certain chances, and we're not here advocating any true insurrection. But he said, maybe a financial crash, maybe a government's sort of conspicuous inability to deal with a problem. He brought up enforcing the law in states or in a portion of a city. So he sort of runs through all these precipitous events, many of which have happened in the last 3 years, or especially the last 10 years. And yet the regime still stands. So we're just left wondering, you know, what really will be the thing that finally reveals the kind of hollow incompetence of a good portion of our leading elite, or our ruling class, or our sclerotic bureaucracy. And all we can do is prepare well and learn well about how to handle such situations, and do our best with our fellow citizens to shore up the sources of Americanness properly understood. And that's why we all come to work every day here. So thank you all for listening. I just wanted one last piece. We're going to skip this last segment again on the conservative movement, with apologies to Amy Wax. She wrote in and said, you guys didn't mention First Things as one of the publications. And she's of course right. Our friend Rusty Reno, one of his senior editors, Matthew Schmitz, who is a Lincoln Fellow of ours, they've been doing wonderful work at First Things. It's been one of the bright spots in the pre and post Trump, the last sort of 10 years or so of conservative commentary. So go check that out if you don't know it. Has a decidedly Roman Catholic bent, but that's all right. Many RCs here at the Claremont Institute, including our own Matt Peterson, and of good standing. And Amy also said it's a daunting topic. She teaches it and barely scratches the surface, and she's of course correct. So just give us another week or 3 maybe to figure out how we want to proceed from here after the very general and kind of slapdash attempt we did last week. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and the hate-filled and racist dc.claremont.org, as we referenced in the beginning of the podcast. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Rate us well, please. It helps with the rankings. Thanks to Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee, our fearless production and engineering crew. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.